Clark and I had been together for 4 years when Dad stopped sending my monthly allowance last March. No explanation, just silence when I called asking about it. Clark noticed immediately when our lifestyle changed. We had been living comfortably in a 2-bedroom apartment downtown. I paid rent and most expenses with Dad's monthly transfers, while Clark contributed what he could. We went out for dinner twice a week, took weekend trips, and never worried about money. When the money stopped coming, everything shifted. I started picking up extra hours to cover our bills. Clark suggested we find a cheaper place, but I refused to downgrade our life. I used my savings to maintain our routine while figuring out what was happening with Dad. Clark began acting differently almost immediately. He stopped suggesting expensive restaurants and started cooking at home more often. He canceled our gym membership and said we could run outside instead. When I bought groceries, he questioned every item that wasn't absolutely necessary. I thought he was being supportive and practical. Clark had always been good with budgets and planning. I assumed he was helping us adjust to temporary circumstances. I appreciated his efforts to make things easier. Over the following months, Clark became increasingly distant. He started staying out later and coming home without much explanation. When I asked about his day, he gave short answers and changed the subject. He stopped making plans for weekends and seemed irritated when I suggested activities. I attributed his mood changes to stress about money. We had both been working more hours and spending less time together. I thought once I figured out the situation with Dad, everything would return to normal. Clark just needed time to adjust to our new circumstances. In July, Clark started mentioning his co-worker Avery frequently. She had apparently bought a new car and was planning expensive vacations. He seemed fascinated by her lifestyle and brought her up in conversations constantly. I found it annoying, but not suspicious. I tried calling Dad multiple times throughout the summer. He answered occasionally, but kept conversations brief. He said he was busy and would call me back, then never did. I left voicemails asking if I had upset him somehow. He never explained why the monthly transfers had ended. Clark grew more impatient with my family situation as months passed. He said I needed to fix whatever was broken instead of depleting our savings. He accused me of being too proud to admit mistakes. He started sleeping on the couch after arguments about money. By October, Clark barely spoke to me except to complain about expenses. He ate dinner in front of the television and spent evenings on his phone. When I suggested we plan something special for my birthday in November, he said we couldn't afford celebrations anymore. I started working additional shifts to save money for a birthday dinner. I made reservations at the restaurant where we had our first date. I told Clark about the plan weeks in advance, and he agreed to go. I was excited to reconnect and celebrate together. Saturday evening arrived, and I waited at the restaurant for 20 minutes past our reservation time. Clark was never late for anything important. I texted asking where he was, but received no response. The hostess kept checking if I wanted to order while other couples filled tables around us. His brother Thomas walked into the restaurant carrying his phone. He approached our table and set his phone down without greeting me. He hit play, and Clark's voice came through the phone speaker. "I'm not coming tonight. I've been using you for your money this whole time. But your dad cut you off, so there's no point anymore. 4 years of pretending to love you was exhausting. I'm already with someone who's actually worth my time. Don't contact me again." The message continued with details about how pathetic I had become without family money. Clark mentioned that he had been seeing with someone for months and was moving in with her. He said I should have fixed things with my father instead of expecting him to live like we were poor. Every person in the restaurant could hear every word. A server stopped mid-step and stared. The elderly couple at the next table looked mortified. Children at nearby tables asked their parents what was happening. Thomas shrugged when I looked at him in shock. He said to make sure everyone heard it. I grabbed my purse and walked out without saying anything. My phone buzzed with a text from Clark, listing items he would pick up from our apartment. Clark wanted to humiliate me publicly because he thought I was now worthless without Dad's money. He sent his brother to deliver the message in the most devastating way possible. He wanted everyone to know exactly how he felt about me. But this idiot never asked the most important question. He never wondered why Dad had really stopped sending money. He just assumed I had screwed up and accepted that as fact. Now, Clark gets to find out what happens when you humiliate someone whose father was just checking if you actually loved his daughter. First update. Oh my God, you guys. The response to my post has been insane. And I'm literally crying, laughing at all your comments, calling Clark a gold digger because that's exactly what this loser turned out to be. But it gets so much worse than I originally posted. So after I walked out of that restaurant, I drove home feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare. The whole thing was so calculated and cruel, having his brother deliver that message, so everyone could hear. That's some next-level psycho behavior that I obviously never saw coming. When I got back to our apartment, Clark had already been there like some kind of thief. Half his stuff was gone. His PlayStation was packed up, and he took the expensive coffee maker that I bought. There was this note on the counter with a list of more crap he wanted to come back for, with specific times he planned to show up. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. While I'm sitting there staring at this note trying to process what just happened, my phone starts blowing up with texts. Not from Clark, from his mother. His mom, Marie, is texting me asking if I'm okay and saying she heard what happened. I'm thinking, oh, thank God. At least someone from his family has some decency. Wrong. She starts going on about how Clark told her I'd been acting strange lately, and that he discovered I was seeing someone else behind his back. I literally had to read these texts 3 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This piece of had told his entire family that I cheated on him, that he'd found out about my affair, and that's why he left me in such a dramatic way, because he was heartbroken and betrayed. So now his whole family thinks I'm some cheating girl who destroyed their precious son, and they're all rallying around him like he's the victim. His mom is texting me about how disappointed she is because she thought I was better than that, and how Clark is devastated, but trying to stay strong. I was so angry. I was literally shaking. 4 years of treating his family like my own family. 4 years of Christmas dinners and birthday parties and family vacations, and this is what I get. Him lying to them about why we broke up, so he doesn't have to admit he left me for someone with more money. I called Clark immediately, and he actually picked up, probably thinking I was going to beg him to come back. Instead, I started screaming at him about his lies to his family. And this dude had the audacity to tell me that it was easier for everyone if his family thought I cheated, rather than getting into the complicated financial stuff. He said his parents were already asking too many questions about why he left me so suddenly, and telling them about money problems would just create more drama. So he decided it was simpler to make me the villain so his family wouldn't judge him for his decision. Clark actually told me I should go along with it because it would make the breakup cleaner for everyone involved. He said if I just let his family think I cheated, they'd stop asking questions and we could both move on with our lives. I hung up on him and immediately started calling his family members to tell them the truth. But guess what? Clark had gotten to them first. His mom, his dad, Thomas, his sister Melanie, they all had the same story. I was the cheater. Clark was the heartbroken victim. And they weren't interested in hearing my side of the story. His sister Melanie actually told me that Clark had shown them proof of my affair. Apparently, Some texts between me and a male co-worker that Clark had completely taken out of context and twisted to look suspicious. These were normal work conversations about projects, but Clark had convinced his family they were evidence of me being unfaithful. The worst part was talking to his dad, Thomas, who I'd always had a great relationship with. This man had walked me down the aisle at his daughter's wedding because my dad was traveling. He'd called me his bonus daughter and always made me feel like part of the family. And now, he's telling me how disappointed he is in my choices and how I broke his son's heart. I tried explaining what really happened about the restaurant, about the voice message, about Clark leaving me for Avery. But Thomas just kept saying that Clark had already told them about my lies and manipulation. Apparently, Clark had prepared them for the possibility that I might try to twist the story to make myself look better. So now, I'm not just dealing with being humiliated and abandoned. I'm dealing with an entire family that thinks I'm a cheating liar because Clark decided it was more convenient than admitting the truth about why he really left. But here's the thing. Clark didn't count on, I'm not some helpless victim who's going to just take this lying down. If he wants to play dirty and destroy my reputation with his family, then he's about to find out what happens when you mess with someone who has nothing left to lose. Clark had made one crucial mistake in his little lie campaign. He'd forgotten that I had access to all our shared accounts and 4 years' worth of actual evidence about what our relationship was really like. While Clark was busy spinning his sob story about being betrayed, I was gathering real proof of what had actually happened. Bank statements showing that I paid for most of our expenses. Photos from social media showing us happy together, right up until the money stopped. Text conversations between us where Clark never once mentioned being suspicious about cheating. The best part was when I found Clark's Instagram messages with Avery. There were heart emojis, inside jokes, plans to meet up, all while he was still living with me and pretending to be committed to our relationship. So, Clark wasn't just a gold digger. He was a cheater who had the balls to accuse me of cheating to cover up his own infidelity and his real reasons for leaving. I sent screenshots of these messages to his mom, Marie, along with a very detailed explanation of what had actually happened. I told her exactly how her precious son had humiliated me in that restaurant, how he'd been seeing Avery behind my back, and how he'd made up the cheating story to avoid admitting he'd left me for someone he thought had better financial prospects. Marie's response was to tell me I was obsessed and delusional, and that I needed to move on and stop harassing their family. She said Clark had warned them that I might become unstable after the breakup and try to cause problems for him and Avery. That's when I realized Clark had played this perfectly. He'd not only stolen 4 years of my life, he'd managed to turn his entire family against me and paint me as the crazy ex-girlfriend who couldn't accept that the relationship was over. Second update. You guys are absolutely killing me with these comments, and I need to tell you what happened next because this story gets so much more insane, and I'm still processing how evil Clark actually turned out to be. So, after Clark's family completely dismissed all my evidence and called me delusional, I was sitting in my apartment feeling like I was going crazy. How do you fight against someone who's rewritten history so completely that even people who've known you for years think you're lying? But then my mom called me, and the first thing she said was, "We know what Clark did to his family, and we're not letting him get away with it." Turns out, my parents had been in contact with Clark's parents for years. They'd exchanged numbers at family gatherings, followed each other on Facebook, the whole thing. My mom had seen Marie's posts about her poor son being betrayed by his cheating girlfriend, and she was livid. My mom told me she'd already called Marie directly to set the record straight, and the conversation had been absolutely explosive. Marie had apparently doubled down on Clark's lies, insisting that her son would never lie about something like that, and that my family was just trying to protect me from the consequences of my own actions. So, my mom did something that made me simultaneously proud and terrified. She invited Clark's entire family over for dinner to discuss the situation like adults and get to the truth. And here's the crazy part. They actually agreed to come. Marie, Thomas, Melanie, even Clark's grandmother, Vada, who I absolutely adored. They all showed up at my parents' house on Sunday evening, probably thinking they were going to confront my family about raising a lying cheater. My mom told me later that the dinner was like a war zone from the moment everyone sat down. Marie immediately started talking about how disappointed she was in me and how she'd trusted me with her son's heart. Thomas was going on about how he'd welcomed me into their family and felt betrayed by my actions. But my dad had prepared for this. He'd printed out everything. Bank statements, social media screenshots, text message threads, even security camera footage from our apartment building showing when Clark had been coming and going during the months he was supposedly being faithful to me. When my dad laid all this evidence on the dining room table, Clark's family went silent. Marie tried to argue that the evidence could be faked, but Thomas started looking through the papers, and his expression completely changed. The Instagram messages between Clark and Avery were particularly damning. There were hundreds of them going back months before my dad stopped the allowance. Heart emojis, plans to meet up when I was at work, Clark complaining about having to pretend everything was fine at home while he figured out his exit strategy. But the worst part was a message where Clark told Avery that he was just waiting for the right moment to leave me, and that he needed to make sure I looked like the bad guy so his family wouldn't judge him for abandoning a 4-year relationship so suddenly. Melanie was reading over her dad's shoulder, and she started crying. She said she couldn't believe her brother had planned something so cruel and calculated. Clark's grandmother, Vad, just kept shaking her head and saying, "This isn't the boy I raised." That's when my mom dropped the real bomb. She told Clark's family that my dad had stopped the allowance on purpose, as a test to see how Clark would treat me when things got tough. She explained that my parents had been suspicious of Clark's motives for months and wanted to see his true character. Thomas asked my dad directly if this was true, and my dad confirmed everything. He said they'd been documenting Clark's behavior throughout the test, and that his reaction had been worse than they'd ever imagined. Marie started getting defensive again, saying that testing someone's relationship was manipulative and unfair. But my mom shut that down immediately by pointing out that they hadn't tested Clark's love. They'd tested his character, and he'd failed spectacularly by choosing cruelty over compassion. Then my dad played them the recordings of my phone conversations with Clark, where he'd been tearing apart my character and bragging about how much better Avery was than me. Hearing their son's voice being so vicious and calculating about someone he'd claimed to love for 4 years was devastating for his family. But Clark's family wasn't ready to admit they'd been wrong. Thomas started arguing that even if Clark had handled things badly, I should have been honest about the family money situation instead of letting him think there was a real crisis. That's when I lost it. I'd been sitting there listening to them make excuses for their son's cruelty, and I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up and started yelling about how Clark had never asked me what was happening with my family. He just assumed I'd screwed up and started treating me like garbage. I told them that their precious son had humiliated me in front of strangers, lied to his own family about why he left, and tried to destroy my reputation to cover up his own cheating and gold-digging behavior. Marie started yelling back that I was being dramatic and that relationships end for lots of reasons. She said maybe Clark had made mistakes, but that didn't make him a monster. But Melanie was done defending her brother. She said she'd always thought something was off about how quickly Clark had moved on with Avery, and now she understood why. She apologized to me and said she was ashamed of how their family had treated me. Thomas was still trying to find ways to excuse Clark's behavior. He said maybe Clark had been confused and scared about the money situation and hadn't handled it well. He suggested that we were all overreacting and that young people make mistakes in relationships. That's when my dad got really angry. He said that what Clark had done wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate pattern of manipulation and cruelty that revealed his true character. He told Thomas that any man who would publicly humiliate a woman he'd claimed to love wasn't someone who deserved excuses or forgiveness. The argument got so heated that Clark's grandmother, Vad, finally spoke up and told everyone to stop yelling. She said she'd heard enough, and that she was deeply ashamed of her grandson's behavior. She looked directly at me and apologized for how their family had treated me. But Marie wasn't ready to back down. She said that even if Clark had made mistakes, my family had no right to test their relationship in secret. She accused my parents of being manipulative and controlling. My mom absolutely went off on her. She said that any parent who raised a son capable of the cruelty Clark had shown me had no business lecturing other people about manipulation. She told Marie that Clark's behavior reflected the values he'd learned at home. The dinner ended with both families screaming at each other. Thomas was defending Marie. My dad was defending my mom, and I was in the middle, trying not to have a complete breakdown. But something important had happened. Clark's lies were starting to fall apart. Melanie and Vader were on my side now, and even Thomas seemed shaken by the evidence of his son's planning and deception. The next day, Melanie called me directly. She said she'd confronted Clark about everything and that the conversation had been horrible. Clark had initially tried to stick to his lies, but when Melanie showed him that she'd seen all the evidence, he'd finally admitted the truth. According to Melanie, Clark had broken down and confessed that he'd made up the cheating story because he was embarrassed about leaving me for financial reasons. He'd told her that he panicked when his family started asking questions and thought it would be easier to make me the villain. But even in his confession, Clark was still trying to justify his actions. He'd told Melanie that the relationship wasn't working anyway, and that the money situation had just been the final straw. He'd insisted that I was better off without him, and that everyone needed to move on. Melanie said she'd never seen her brother be so cold and calculating about another person's feelings. She told him that she was disgusted by his behavior and that he needed to tell his parents the truth immediately, but Clark refused. He said that admitting to his lies now would just create more drama and hurt more people. He told Melanie that I would get over it eventually and that dredging up the truth would only make things worse for everyone. That's when Melanie realized that her brother wasn't just a liar. He was completely lacking in empathy or remorse for what he'd done to me. She said it was like talking to a stranger who happened to look like her brother. She told me that she was going to make sure her parents knew the truth, whether Clark wanted them to or not. She said their family owed me a massive apology and that Clark needed to face consequences for his actions. But convincing Marie and Thomas wasn't going to be easy. They'd built their whole understanding of the situation around Clark being the victim. And admitting they were wrong meant acknowledging that they'd treated me horribly based on lies. Meanwhile, Clark was apparently telling Avery that his crazy ex-girlfriend was trying to destroy his relationships with his family by spreading lies about him. Avery was posting on social media about how sad it was when people couldn't accept that relationships end and had to create drama to get attention. So now I was fighting a war on multiple fronts, trying to clear my name with Clark's family. dealing with his lies to his new girlfriend, and watching him continue to play the victim while painting me as the unstable ex who couldn't move on. Last update, guys. I cannot even begin to describe what happened this week because Clark's entire life just imploded in the most spectacular way possible. And I am living for every single moment of his pathetic downfall. So, remember how Melanie was trying to convince her parents that Clark had lied about everything? Well, she didn't have to try very hard because my dad decided to take matters into his own hands and called Thomas directly. My dad told Thomas that he had something important to discuss about Clark and that they needed to meet in person. Thomas agreed, probably thinking my dad wanted to apologize or work things out. Wrong! My dad showed up at Thomas's office with a folder full of evidence that would destroy Clark's lies forever. But it wasn't just the Instagram messages and recordings this time. My dad had been documenting Clark's behavior for months during the test, and he had evidence that would blow Thomas's mind. Photos of Clark going out to expensive restaurants with Avery while telling me we couldn't afford to eat out. Credit card statements showing Clark buying gifts for Avery while complaining about our budget. To me, the worst part was a recording my dad had made during one of our family barbecues, where Clark was asking my mom about inheritance laws and how family money gets passed down. Clark had literally been calculating my worth as a future wife based on what he thought he could eventually inherit. Thomas listened to everything in complete silence, and my dad said you could watch Clark's father's face change as he realized his son wasn't just a liar. He was a calculating gold digger who had played their entire family. But here's where it gets absolutely insane. After Thomas heard all the evidence, he didn't just apologize to my dad. He called Clark immediately and told him to come to his office right now for an emergency family meeting. Clark showed up thinking his dad wanted to discuss the drama I was causing for their family. Instead, Thomas played him the recordings of his own voice being vicious about me and calculating about my family's money. Clark's face apparently went white as he realized his lies had completely fallen apart. Thomas started yelling at Clark about how disgusted he was that he'd raised a son capable of such cruelty and deception. He said he'd never been more ashamed of anyone in his life, and that Clark had betrayed everything their family stood for. But Clark tried to defend himself. He started arguing that the test had been unfair, and that his reaction was understandable given the circumstances. He told his dad that everyone was overreacting, and that relationships end badly sometimes. He told Clark that he was moving out of the apartment immediately because Thomas wasn't paying rent for someone who could treat another person with such calculated cruelty. Clark started panicking because he couldn't afford the apartment on his own, and Thomas said that was Clark's problem to figure out. Then Thomas said he was also taking back the car he'd been helping Clark pay for because he wasn't supporting someone with such terrible character. Clark started begging and making excuses, saying he'd learned from his mistakes and would do better. But Thomas said it was too late. Clark had shown who he really was, and there were no second chances for that level of cruelty and manipulation. So, within 24 hours, Clark went from having a nice apartment and reliable transportation to being basically homeless and carless. And the best part, he was too proud to tell Avery what had happened. So he had to scramble to find somewhere to stay, without admitting his family had completely disowned him. According to Melanie, Clark has been staying with his old college roommate, Hugo, and telling Avery that he's temporarily between apartments while he looks for a better place. He's been taking Ubers everywhere and claiming his car is in the shop for repairs. But Clark's lies started falling apart when Avery wanted to see his apartment and meet his family. Clark had to make up excuse after excuse about why that wasn't possible right now. and Avery was starting to get suspicious about his living situation. That's when Clark made the stupidest decision of his pathetic life. He started calling me, begging me to help him explain things to Avery. He wanted me to confirm his story about why we broke up and make him look less crazy to his new girlfriend. When Clark called me the first time, I was so shocked I almost hung up immediately. But then I realized this was my chance to destroy him completely. So I stayed on the line and let him gravel. Clark started with his usual about how he'd made mistakes, but that we could both move on and be mature about the situation. He said he just needed me to have one conversation with Avery to clear up some misunderstandings about our relationship. I started laughing at him. I told Clark that the only misunderstanding was him thinking I would ever help him with anything after what he'd done to me. I said he was a pathetic loser who had destroyed his own life through his greed and cruelty. Clark started getting angry and demanding that I help him because we'd meant something to each other for 4 years. He said I owed him basic decency and that I was being vindictive by refusing to help. That's when I really let him have it. I told Clark that he'd thrown away 4 years of love for money that wasn't even real, that he'd humiliated me in front of strangers, and that he'd lied to his entire family about me being a cheater. I said he deserved everything that was happening to him. Clark started crying on the phone and begging me to remember the good times we'd had together. He said he knew he'd made mistakes, but that deep down, I knew he wasn't a bad person. I told Clark that the test had revealed exactly what kind of person he was, someone who would abandon and destroy someone he claimed to love the moment it became convenient. I said he was selfish, calculating, and cruel, and that his family was right to disown him. Clark got desperate and started offering to tell Avery the truth about why we broke up if I would just help him keep his living situation secret. He said he would admit to his family that he'd lied about me cheating if I would cover for him about being kicked out. I told Clark that I wouldn't help him deceive another woman the way he deceived me. I said Avery deserved to know what kind of person she was dating and what happened to people who trusted him. That's when Clark started screaming at me, calling me a vindictive BTI who couldn't accept that our relationship was over. He said I was trying to destroy his life out of jealousy and that I needed to move on. I started laughing even harder and told Clark that I wasn't destroying his life. He'd done that all by himself, through his own choices. I said I was actually grateful he'd shown me who he really was before I wasted any more time on him. Clark kept calling back from different numbers when I blocked him, and each conversation got more desperate and pathetic. He started offering me money to help him, then threatening to tell people I was harassing him, then going back to begging and crying. During our last conversation, Clark was completely broken down. He admitted that Avery was starting to ask questions he couldn't answer, and that his friend Hugo was getting tired of him staying on his couch. He said he didn't know what he was going to do if his lies kept falling apart. I told Clark that maybe he should have thought about consequences before he decided to be such a cruel, calculating piece of I said he'd made his choices, and now he got to live with them. But the absolute best part happened when Avery somehow got my number and called me directly. She said Clark had mentioned me as his ex-girlfriend and that she wanted to clear the air about some things she'd heard. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. I told Avery that I'd be happy to tell her the truth about Clark and our relationship. I explained everything: the restaurant humiliation, the lies to his family, the months of him treating me like garbage when he thought I didn't have money. Avery was quiet for a long time, then said that Clark's story about our breakup had been completely different. He told her that I was unstable and obsessive, and that he'd had to end things for his own safety. I sent Avery screenshots of Clark's Instagram messages where he'd been flirting with her while still living with me. I told her about the test my parents had done and how Clark had failed it by choosing cruelty over loyalty. Avery said she was starting to understand why Clark had been so evasive about his living situation and family relationships. She thanked me for being honest with her and said she had a lot to think about. The next day, Melanie called me laughing because Clark had shown up at his parents' house, crying and begging them to take him back. He'd admitted that Avery had broken up with him after talking to me and that he had nowhere else to go. Marie and Thomas told Clark that he'd made his choices and now he had to live with the consequences. They said he'd destroyed every relationship in his life through his own selfishness and that they weren't going to enable him anymore. Clark is apparently staying in cheap hotels now, using what little savings he has while trying to figure out his next move. But here's the part that makes me laugh the most. Clark still doesn't know about the inheritance my dad mentioned. He threw away a relationship with someone whose family could have set him up for life. And he did it for someone with a slightly better salary than me. My parents started the monthly allowance again. By the way, not because I need it, but because they wanted to make sure I knew that people who actually love you don't abandon you when things get tough. Clark is learning that lesson the hard way, and I couldn't be happier about it. Thank you, Reddit. Watching the trash take itself out has been absolutely incredible.